Okay, so NEW302, Odyssey Part 2. So we were discussing sort of general considerations in the last video and talking about Odysseus as the clever man and talking about this sort of general frame setting of islands in the sea and progressing from, right, the war and Troy to Ithaca and home and the sort of circuitous, right, labyrinthine approach through these things. Okay, so the book starts out with Telemachus, as I mentioned, and I'm sort of going to de-emphasize that section for here. With Telemachus, we have this issue where, right, Odysseus has been gone for a long time. There are 108 suitors who are hanging around. And what are these 108 suitors? They're parasitic, right? They are just like, hunting and eating the meat and drinking the wine and hanging around and attempting in a lustful fashion to convince Penelope to, right, come on side. They're like, forget it. Like, Odysseus is dead. Like, you should marry one of us. 108 people. Which is also weird because they seem to have this like strange, right? There's a quality to them where they're clearly collective. We don't get a lot of differentiation between them. But what they keep saying is like, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. Like, come on side. And meanwhile, they're just soaking up resources in this parasitic way. They're not contributing in any way, right? This is very often the kind of relationship that we have to certain complexes, right, that hang around in us, and they just like sit around and absorb our energy, and they don't kind of give back in any sense. And right, they attempt, in some inner sense, to convince us, like, forget it, let go, just let me eat. They likewise have this quality of the appetites, right? They're very body oriented and sort of appetite driven. So they eat, they drink, right? They're absorbing, but also they're compelled by lust. There is this lustful quality, right? You got to remember that, marriage and sex, as often as not within the social framework, are very closely tied together. So this isn't just a question of them, looking to have like a wholesome long-term relationship with Penelope per se, right? They want to get her into bed. There is this quality of her as a lust object, right? That they're all kind of hanging around and waiting for. And she, of course, is forestalling this by sort of like, yes, agreeing in a relatively coy fashion with all of them. Yes, yes, yes. As soon as I finish, weaving this thing. And of course, she weaves during the day. She unweaves at night. And so she never completes it, right? She's stalling. She's stalling. She's keeping it in a holding pattern. But this does occupy her energies. There is a quality of mourning to it, right? She's not completely absorbed into her grief. She's sort of biding her time by weaving and unweaving and weaving and unweaving. She's refusing to close the door entirely on Odysseus and refusing to sort of carry to these other forces, but instead she's sort of holding the line with the idea that, right, with sort of hope, faith, right? Odysseus will be back. Odysseus will be back. Yeah, so that weaving and unweaving, also you can draw, of course, links between that and sort of the weaving of fate, as it were, or the weaving of time. This is a link that many cultures make, the idea of sort of weaving the threads of lives or weaving the threads of events as being a certain kind of symbolism. And for Penelope, of course, it's woven and almost complete, and then it is unwoven, right? It's reduced to chaos. And so again, we see here through the lens that we're looking at, I'm going to stop qualifying this. I'm just going to go ahead from here with the idea that you're remembering this is a tentative interpretation. In weaving and unweaving, we are looking at, a kind of like almost gelling and then falling apart. This, of course, is very in keeping, frankly, with interestingly what we know about sort of a brain functionality, if we were going to get into that. But also, of course, the general theme, it's like our tapestry isn't done until we're dead, right? But we weave and we unweave it. We get to a state, and then it's like, no, now it's time to unpick those things. As I've mentioned many times, very often the solution that we have at one point in our life becomes the obstacle at another point in our life, that we have to unweave ourselves, right? And this is something that the ego is intensely resistant to, because it identifies very closely with it. And we identify closely with it. And furthermore, right, when that entangles together with persona in various ways, there's an identification that maybe needs to be broken down, right? And the key, of course, is to disidentify without disintegrating, right? You don't want to completely fall apart. You just sometimes need to bring things down to a somewhat more fundamental level and build from there. So we have in her sort of weaving work, we have this sort of overarching idea. And this is what the feminine at home is doing. Now, it's important to note, this is one of the sort of many places where the feminine is playing this integral role, right? The feminine in the form of his wife and the mother of his son is sort of back in Ithaca and is engaged in this mournful process of holding off, right, predatory force, right, that is sort of camped parasitically in the space. And instead it's doing this thing, it's holding a space by weaving and unweaving, right, for Odysseus to find his way home and to see fit to find his way home, both to actually find his way, but also to like decide to come home. Telemachus, of course, is trapped inside of this and is, faithful to his father, but is sort of trying to undertake efforts to overthrow this situation, right? And part of his task, as we've discussed, is this sort of first half of life heroic task. He's partly trying to be his own man, but he's doing so in sort of the defense and service of his father. And it's not sufficient to simply wait for his father. There needs to be this proactive effort on his part, and he's rebuffed quite strongly. This is frankly generally consistent with what we see in first half of life endeavors. It's a rare case where people surge out of the gates and on their first try at the age of 20, they attack something and boom, they hit success. It's just rare, right? You look at sort of the accounts of people, for instance, in, business. And what you'll see is people saying like, oh yeah, like fail hard, fail better. Well, what does that mean? It means that they learn from error, and that you do things and then they tank. And you have to sort of get used to the idea of failing in your efforts as a way of honing and improving your efforts. But boy, it's demoralizing. It's hard, right? You're throwing yourself behind something and then your heroic energies don't seem to matter, or you can't muster them with sort of the fullness of will and action that you wish you could. Right? So that's pretty consistent. Basically, Telemachus takes some stabs at this and just miserably fails. He can't sort of overturn these forces. He is in fact laughed at, right, when he attempts to marshal these forces. So when we consider Telemachus in those terms, right, we get that sort of first half of life quality. However, in the main, what we are interested in looking at here is Odysseus. It's the second half of life that's why the book is named after Odysseus. It's the second half of life that we're concerned with and his sort of quality. So, okay, chronologically speaking, right, we start out sort of with who's in his court? Athena. And Athena is, again, a female figure. She's a goddess and she's a female figure, but she's an interestingly composite female figure, Athena, right? As a goddess, she is a wisdom goddess, right? Associated with wisdom and with owls and so on and so forth. But she is also a warrior goddess, right? She has a kind of intercategorical quality, Athena, right? She springs from Zeus in sort of this warrior fashion. And so she's a wisdom goddess, but also a war goddess. She's this natural counterpoint to her brother Apollo, right? And so Athena, is a very sort of interesting composite figure. For the Greeks, right, she had some curiously sort of male properties. She is in some sense kind of integrated, but in a wise fashion. She's like a wise and relatively benevolent version, right, of Mercurius. She partakes of the masculine warrior energy, but also she stands in for wisdom and so on and so forth. So we have Athena, and Athena is sort of, something of a patron, as it were, right, is sort of watching over Odysseus. Okay, but our narrative, properly speaking, post-Troy, starts out with Odysseus and crew and a bunch of boats, right? Lots of men, lots of boats. And we start with the failed raid, okay? And the failed raid, you know, I mean, what is that? It's about failure. Here they've just had, you know, like a major success in the war. Stomping Troy was like a signature event of the ancient world, and it completely hinged on Odysseus, right? They basically, you know, if it were not for the Trojan horse, they wouldn't have succeeded. Odysseus is the linchpin of this thing, and boy, this has inflated him. So they're supposed to be on the way home, and they undertake this raid, and the raid fails. And this is the first sign that something is off, right? His methods and his tricks, the notice of aggression, it's like it's not quite working, right? Something is not quite lined up. It's an early sign. Okay, and then they are driven off course. So, right, sort of in a sense, Storm and divine power conspires to drive them off course. So again, you can see that this is sort of a different version of I am pointed at something, but I am not quite getting there, right? Not only did my raid, my effort to sort of take by force, and that's to, right, to overpower other people by force, to in an organized fashion, right, slay my enemies by force, to take their treasure by force, to rape their women by force, which is to say, right, to acquire all the goods, to absorb, to maximize, to, right, all the things. And again, within the moral framework of the Greeks, like this is all permissible stuff, right? This is not like, the problem here is that you were like a bad person and did a raid. That's not the way to look at it. Rather, at this point, we want to sort of abstract this up and be like, right, the point is that he's failing in his task, right? He's trying to do something. He's trying to acquire unto himself and his men, and it's not clicking post this big event at Troy. And then he's driven off course. And driven off course is like, look, you're pointed one way, but the wind is not cooperating. A storm blows up, and you just don't go the direction that you expect. This is, of course, I think on reflection, an extremely common psychological experience, right? In my experience, in fact, things very seldom go the way that you expect them to. This is why when I talk to people, clients, and certainly within my own experience, I talk about the practice of arguing with ghosts, as I put it, which is when you're having an extended like argument conversation, you have an upcoming conflict, or not even necessarily conflict. Sometimes people practice words of love, but you have this upcoming conflict and you sort of like have this conversation without the other person in the room, and you're practicing and you're coming up with your lines and what they're going to say. And then when they say this, I'll say that. And when they say this, and if you ever try to roll that stuff out, it's just deeply wooden. It doesn't work, right? Because typically the conversation doesn't go the way you imagine. Things seldom do. I could count on one hand the number of times that I imagined something and then something went the way that I imagined it. If you think in terms of broad principles, you can sort of anticipate stuff. But when you start thinking in terms of specifics and you try to imagine how things are going to unfold, things don't go that way most of the time. And sometimes they really don't go that way. You expect that something is going to go in one direction and it goes in another. And to really sit in that experience, right, is to recognize how little rational control we have over our engagement with the future. If you plan your sequence of moves extremely in advance, you're bound to be blown in a different direction, right? On the other hand, if you stick to sort of a general principle, if you develop a stance, as it were, right, a stance towards things, and you have sort of a pole star, then you can navigate in that direction. That's where I'm going, not sort of I'm heading west, but I need to get there. And if I, get blown off course, right, then I can recorrect and go in that direction. So first we get the failed raid, then we get sort of being driven off course. And the first place that we are driven off course is, of course, the land of the Lotus Eaters. So what's the land of the Lotus Eaters? The sort of classic, version of this that has sort of infiltrated modern culture is to associate this stuff with a kind of opiate base. Lotus does, in its sort of natural form, seem to have some psychoactive properties. So blue lotus was well known, for instance, among the Egyptians as both an incense and seemingly a consumed thing. And it seems to have certain kinds of, if not opioid, definitely psychoactive properties, right? So the consumption of lotus seems to have a lulling, a soporific, a tranquilizing kind of effect. And it would have been relatively common in parts of the ancient world, of course, to mix lotus together with wine. So the idea was you had wine and you steeped it with lotus. That was a pretty common practice throughout the ancient world generally, to like add things into wine. Wine was often considered to be, you can look at medical texts in the period and things, and wine was considered to be sort of the basis of most sort of curative potions, as it were, right? Medicine to a great extent, right? And sort of pharmacology was about taking all these sort of natural things and mixing them together in certain proportions and then taking it as wine. That was one of the sort of bases of the pharmacon and pharmacy. So, so lotus has that kind of role. And lotus is also closely associated, certainly for the Greeks, with the Egyptians. And the Egyptians, you know, have this special place for the Greeks, as it were. We see this in Plato, especially, right? Plato talks about having conversations with this is where we get like the Atlantis myth. So there's like the conversation with the Egyptian priest. And the idea here is like the Greeks at this point were sort of very aware that there were civilizations that preceded them considerably. And Egypt is one of those. You know, we think, of course, the Greeks as ancient history, but Egypt was older by thousands of years and had a cultural continuity that's hard for us to understand in modern context, right? Like a basic cultural continuity where things largely operated according to a cycle and a set of rules for hundreds, thousands of years. It's almost inconceivable in modern terms that a country would remain stable for 1,000 years. I mean, can you imagine a country and a culture basically being the same for 1,000 years now? Like, this is sort of outside of our field of understanding. But, you know, for the ancient world, that was possible in Egypt, you know, at some level kind of was doing this. So they were, for the Greeks, they were ancient. And the Greeks have lots of these kinds of encounters, right? You know, Alexander the Great, who's of course closely associated with the Greeks, marvels when he's conquering the world and they come across the ruins of Babylon. Because it's like, oh, look at these huge ruins that precede us, and they're ruins. Like, it's not even like it's an active thing. This comes before us. That sense of the ancient world and a world of giants and gods, this sort of golden era stuff, right, is very extant for the Greeks. And so that link of the lotus to Egyptians and the sort of power of the lotus as this lulling soporific is like it's an ancient world kind of thing. And it's not just a drug, it's like an indulgence. And that's what we see with the land of the lotus eaters, right? So his men eat the lotus, and what happens? They lose motivation, right? They suddenly, it's like they don't care anymore, right? They don't care anymore. They lose motivation. They're sort of lulled into this drugged state. And, you know, and he has to like rouse them and get them the hell out of there, because it's extremely dangerous to be lulled into that state, right? If you want to kind of keep going. This we can look at as being sort of metaphoric for complacency, or we can treat it less metaphorically, and we can look at it in terms of, essentially speaking, drugs, right? Drugs have an important cultural role in virtually every culture, right? Mind-altering substances, as all of you know, I do work in this area. I have pretty strong views about this. And they're an integral part, right? Altered states and the pursuit of altered states is a pretty integral part of virtually every human culture. There are a few cultures that don't use like a lot of psychoactives, but in those cases, they use ritual techniques. You know, the point is that the sort of pursuit of the altered state and the use of the altered state is basically a human universal. And generally speaking, it is the case that most cultures, when they discover psychoactives, put them to use. Different cultures use different psychoactives. It's not all universal, right? But we go to tremendous lengths to do so, okay? Ayahuasca is a good example of this, right? Like, it has been much marveled upon that ayahuasca requires the combination of multiple different plants from the Amazon rainforest, right? That individually are not particularly psychoactive. And like, how do you get to that, right? Now, if you ask me, you know, you don't count humans out. You know, this is a little bit like, wow, the pyramids are so complex, aliens must have built it. Well, maybe, or maybe humans are just like really industrious and actually quite clever about this sort of thing, right? It's not that everybody in the ancient world is an idiot. they're quite capable of stuff. And that goes back much further even than we generally give credit. So if you look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, this is a very clear sign that like our narrative around, when humans were suddenly capable of doing stuff is pretty screwy. Humans have been capable of doing massive earthworks for a long time. Likewise, humans have a dedication to sussing out what's useful in their environment, where, our notion of what useful means, it might be quite different. And the point is that ayahuasca is this like amazing feat in a way, right, of combining natural elements to provide a certain kind of psychoactive. Same thing. If you look at the consumption of the Amanita muscaria, right, the Amanita muscaria mushroom, Amanita, that classic red and white mushroom, it's like associated with, like it's the like toadstool that fairies and brownies hide under. It may have provided the red and white color scheme for Santa Claus, right? Consuming that thing, if you just eat Amanita muscaria or various mushrooms in that family, it's pretty toxic. And what you find is shamanic practices where things like they feed the mushrooms to a reindeer, and then they collect the reindeer urine, and then they set the reindeer urine aside in the cold, and it freezes and the top layer freezes off, and then they drink concentrated reindeer urine because the reindeer, the body of the ungulate, has purified it so that they can just get the psychoactive, and they use that to do work. Humans go to substantial lengths is what I'm getting at. Okay, so nevertheless, there is a quality where it's like, of course, these things can be used to seek and elevate certain states, but they can also just be used to lull oneself. They can be used as a substitute for living. And we see this all the time, right? One of the main culprits in this story is wine. We'll see wine turn up a bunch of times as like, yeah, it's a great thing to have good wine and to water it and to share it and to celebrate and to be seized by the spirit. But also wine is dangerous. Wine is a trap, right? Wine can lull you, etc. The lotus falls into this camp, right? It's the same thing with opiates. I mean, we're amid an opiate crisis, right? And the point there is like, of course, opiates have a useful role. There's a reason everybody was so excited when they discovered morphine, because if you've ever had a minor surgery without anesthetic of any kind, you very rapidly learn what's so great about anesthetics, right? Painkillers are useful, but when we're talking about the opiate crisis, like what's happening there? I mean, yes, people are dulling pain, but what's the pain that they're dulling? It's an existential pain, typically. We know from addiction studies that when people fall into these patterns of use, yes, some of it is physical, right? It's hard once you're taking these things, right? They're fun and exciting. They feel like love, and they sweep your cares away. And of course, like withdrawing from that is dangerous and unpleasant, right? So there are, of course, physical considerations, but above and beyond that, considerations are emotional. This is the classic Bruce Alexander material around rat park. If you give a rat, an option between food and dilute cocaine water, yeah, it'll pick dilute cocaine water all day, because rats in a lab are isolated in little cages with very little enrichment. They have nothing to do. And rats naturally are social, and they're creative, and they're exploratory. So if you don't give them anything to do or any rats to socialize with, of course they drink cocaine water all day long. If I got put in solitary confinement and you were like, do you want to just sit and think, or would you rather have cocaine water? Sign me up. Give me the Coca-Cola, please. Fun fact, Coca-Cola obviously no longer contains cocaine per se, but it does still contain extracts from coca. Which they have like special dispensation from the US government to import, despite the fact that it would otherwise be illegal. So there is some botanical extract that is not cocaine, but that they do extract from coca that goes into Coca-Cola. Last I checked with the formula. Fun fact. I have often wondered what an original Coca-Cola was like. In small concentrations, of course, cocaine is, a fairly standard stimulant, not so different than caffeine. That's why they added caffeine in. And, when it's in its indigenous context, they chew a little bit, it treats altitude sickness, and it gives you a boost of energy. It's like having a cup of coffee. So I've sort of wondered what an original Coca-Cola was like. But anyway, long story short, right? Bruce Alexander, Rat Park, yes, absent right? Other kinds of fulfilling and meaningful, structure and stimulation and interpersonal stimulation, yeah, of course, rats drink the cocaine water. If you put them into an environment where they have other rats and meaningful tasks and things to explore and ways to engage, typically they're not that interested in the cocaine water. Most of them drop it. And likewise, this is what we often see with humans, right? Sort of addiction in that sense is quite rare. Most people are quite capable of taking opiates and then just stopping taking them at the end, right? And so there is an emptiness quality. People are often missing something emotionally, and that's not their fault. I mean, usually that's a question of sort of trauma and environment and whatever, but to want to be sort of lulled, right, by a drug state. And the same thing goes, this is not just a question of opiates, the same thing goes for, whatever, constantly drinking or being stoned all the time, right? Any case where somebody is like, I want to be in an altered state all day, every day, it's like, why? Like, right? And usually there are good reasons if you're empathic for it. But the thing is, like, typically that represents a fleeing from regular consciousness and fleeing from sort of the problems, right? This is the Lotus Eaters. So, of course, his men, right, his sort of motivation runs straight to this and starts allowing itself to be lulled. And he has to like shake it out, right? And we leave. Okay, so then after the Lotus Eaters, all of a sudden we reach the land of the Cyclops. And I read that whole chapter out loud, so I'm just gonna, hit some specific elements of it, some things I sort of want to focus on. One of the things that I want to focus on with the Cyclops is that Cyclopses have one eye. And this is something that I've touched on a bit before, but I want to explicate further. What is it to have one eye, right? If you consider for a second, right, if you, take something and then you close an eye, what do you lose? Well, you lose depth perception. Depth perception is complex, right? Depth perception is complex. It requires two eyes with two integrated streams of information that are not simply additive, but they're synthetic. You got to think about this. I mean, this is something I harp on a lot. And I'll share one of the reasons I harp on it as often as I do, quite frankly, is that when I was a kid, I started to get a wandering eye. So my eye would drift. It'll still happen if I'm tired. So I was experiencing double vision. And this is before I think I even wore glasses. It was when I was even younger. And the docs were pretty worried. And they told me when I was about 6 that I was going to have to wear an eye patch. So in kindergarten, my kindergarten photos, I'm wearing a white eye patch, which I must say that I did do my level best to sort of rock as the white pirate minus the rest of the costume. But it made a big impression on me because they were like, look, we have to cover your good eye to strengthen the weak eye, right? You have to like strengthen the muscles because right now it's just sort of drifting off. And indeed, I would frankly enjoy this process. I would sit in kindergarten or class or something, and I would spend hours letting my eyes defocus and drifting into two images and then recombining the images and let it drift apart. And I would do this on purpose. But what I didn't sort of realize at the time, and the docs were like, look, we have to cover your good eye to strengthen the weak eye, right? You got to wear this eye patch because if your eyes continue to drift in this way, eventually the competing streams of information, your visual cortex will just decide to shut one off, right? They'll just turn off the input from the one eye, and then you'll have one eye. Now, at the time, obviously that scared me. I have no idea. I've never looked to see whether or not, I must admit, I've never looked to see whether or not that is sort of literally the case. I don't know whether that, because frankly, sometimes, right, docs say things and either it's based on outmoded information or they're sort of telling it to compel an outcome, right? This is like when you give people a placebo, right? You tell them it's medicine, generally speaking, especially with kids. So I have no idea whether or not that account was correct, but it did nevertheless, right, produce like a pretty strong, like, oh my God, like one of my eyes will shut off. My brain will shut off an eye. Okay. So the process of having two eyes and attempting to integrate that information is the process of producing depth. When, we see a different thing out of each eye and we integrate it. I've tried to make this point sort of repeatedly. And to integrate it is not simply to produce an overlap. It's not just to produce a combination, this eye plus this eye, because then we would see two images of the same thing, like offset. Instead, the information is combined and an additional dimension is revealed. I can see more deeply, more deeply. Now, that, of course, has advantages, but it also has disadvantages, because you can, of course, as I did, have sort of competition if your eyes are not completely aligned. And in that case, right, you'll move to simplification. It's not ideal, but you'll sort of simplify things into a flat image. This is what it is to have one eye. You have no depth perception, but you have a singularity of vision. You are one-pointed. Now, one-pointedness is something that can be quite useful when you're developing skills. Human beings are capable, if they develop a state of one-pointedness, of taking themselves to remarkable degrees of skill in a particular way, right? And you see this sometimes. I mean, you know, sort of in the internet era, it's not uncommon to come across these instances of people who have honed some remarkably narrow skill through one-pointedness, and you think, oh my God, like you put a lot of time into that. The example, of course, that I always come around to is this guy that can cut bullets out of the air with a samurai sword, which is a pretty, like, that's a pretty specialized thing to learn. You'd have to spend a lot of time. And I think I saw it in an episode of Mythbusters that they actually tested it. Basically, they shot plastic BBs faster than he could possibly have perceived. And yeah, after a few tries, boom, he hits one. You know, he doesn't like perfectly cut it in half, but he hits it. He cuts it out of the air with a sword, moving at like bullet speeds. This is amazing and remarkable. Likewise, I sometimes point people to this documentary, Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which is about a guy who's like sushi obsessive. That's what he thinks about all the time. And his son, who's due to inherit the business, is sort of trying to capture this passion that this guy has for sushi. And it's not quite working. Like he is not one-pointed in the same way. So one-pointedness can turn you into a certain kind of remarkable being, right? And we elevate and idolize one-pointedness. Another example that I would point people to that I had the opportunity to take in a few months ago was the Kobe Bryant documentary. Oh, what's it called? I can't remember, but Kobe Bryant did this documentary before his untimely death. And he talks at great length about, right, his relationship to basketball and the one-pointedness. And it's a really great documentary, not least because you get to see how his one-pointedness emerges from this place of pain, right? Even if his, you know, he was always moving, his interpersonal relationships and friendships were unreliable and temporary, but the basketball was always there, right? And he sinks himself into it, and it has effects, right? It, you know, like starts eating his marriage, and well worth watching. What is that documentary called? I can't recall, but anyway, the Kobe Bryant documentary. Right? Again, there's this kind of one-pointedness. And there's a sense that, you know, developing a one-pointedness in that sense can turn you into something remarkable, but at what cost? The answer, of course, is that you drill into one thing, but at the cost of everything else, every other aspect in your life. Now, it's easy to idolize that, and certainly some people come to this sort of one-pointedness, and we envy them because of the tremendous like power that they develop in one area, but they lose depth and flexibility, right? Power in one area is fine, but like not everything is basketball, right? Not everything is cutting bullets out of the air with a sword. Not everything is sushi. You know, in developing that kind of power, right? If the cost is that you are not acquiring skills in other parts of your life, often you will suffer thereby, right? So this is sort of one-pointedness in a sense. This is the quality of having one eye. Having one eye and a singularity of vision doesn't admit alternatives, and it doesn't admit depth. And it is a source of tremendous power, but it is simultaneously a kind of weakness. We see a similar sort of theme emerge, for instance, in The Lord of the Rings, right? In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron is what? A single eye wreathed in flame, right? He no longer has a body at this point, basically, right? By the time of The Lord of the Rings, like he's sort of lost his physical form. And so instead, he's just this eye. He's just a single like eye, you know, wreathed eye. There's enormous power to it, a sort of a spot-like quality, but also it can't really think outside of its own perspective, right? That is the whole point of The Lord of the Rings. We can ambush him by sending something under the radar. There's no point in coming straight at him with all of the great figures of power from Middle Earth because he's expecting that. That's his framework. He thinks in power. Whereas instead, if somebody sort of sneaks in, right, takes the small road, right, it is sort of humble in the approach, it won't see it coming because he just doesn't think in those terms. He thinks in terms of power and he sees in terms of power. So, right, the expectation. So Sauron is a good example. And the Cyclops similarly, right, has a single eye but has tremendous power. The Cyclopses live separately. They are laws unto themselves. They're sort of barbaric from the perception of the Greeks. Well, what does that mean? It means that they don't have sort of things in common, right? Every one of them lives in their own cave and has their own flock and is a law unto themselves. Now, that doesn't mean, interestingly, that they have no social exchange. That's obviously shown at the end of the Cyclops chapter because Polyphemus calls out, right, for assistance, and he has been tricked so that he does not receive it, right? Nobody is hurting me. And they're all like, then what's your issue? Like, fuck off. Stop waking us up. Right? So he calls for assistance. That's sort of a possibility. You can gather in a militia-like fashion, but there's no specific organization. There's no inherent law. There's no organization. There's no civilization. Civilization, by its very nature, is about being able to take multiple views and multiple perspectives, right? This is something our civilization is having real problems with right now, right? If you want to look at, the heart of the political schism, right? It's that both sides, on the left-right dichotomy, which I have problems with, right, are sort of sick of trying to explain their position or be seen by the other side. It's not my job to explain the position, or I don't care what you think, right? I don't care what you think anymore. And both sides are operating, essentially speaking, as though there is some way that they're going to win. But when your population is 50-50, what does it mean to win? Like, what does it mean? You're going to overpower half? Right? And so it's set against itself. The concept of compromise is lost. And both sides will say that it's the other side that doesn't want to compromise. And that is somewhat true. The other side doesn't want to compromise, right? And yet, compromising across a variety of positions is precisely what constitutes civilization. And it's precisely what constitutes, certainly, democratic civilization, right? Democracy is the process of political compromise between a large group of people so that, things are expressed in a sort of majoritarian way. But by definition, like a compromise is a state of agreement where nobody is completely happy with what they got. So the point is that being one-eyed in this sense is existing in a state of like one-pointedness, a law unto yourself. You've got your own cave and your own flocks and your own law, and that renders you powerful, right? You answer in some sense to nobody. And it's interesting that Polyphemus is, in addition to being a Cyclops, a giant and one-eyed, is of course the son of Poseidon, something that comes to bear by the end of the thing. He's the sea god, the lord of earthquakes, right? But also the lord of the sea. If you've wondered why earthquakes in the sea, I propose this. The sea is unstable, right? That's sort of its whole thing. It's unstable, right? It's liquid and it's tempestuous and it's unstable. And earthquakes are when the land becomes like the sea, right? To have, right, literally waves passing through the ground. If you've ever been in a tremor or an earthquake, it's quite an experience. I've only had the experience once, and it was quite striking because I was in a place that doesn't normally experience this kind of thing. I was up in Owen Sound on the Great Bruce Peninsula, and all of a sudden, everything started rattling and shaking. And I was like, what's happening? Right? I, of course, being a Cold War kid, immediately jumped to the idea that it was probably a nuclear strike. And it turned out it wasn't. It was a minor earthquake that occurred in upstate New York that we felt that far away. But the point was that there was a sudden instability. Things that ought to be still suddenly weren't. They were moving and shaking. Very strange experience, right? When I noticed it, it's like rattling, and I looked up and I was like, why is everything moving? Right? Why is everything moving? That's what an earthquake is. Why is everything moving? And then, of course, structure begins to fall down. You can't count on the solidity of the ground, hence earthquakes in the sea. So Poseidon rules over a kind of chaos. Now, we're used to thinking, of the three sort of the triad of Greek gods, right? Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and ruling over these three realms. And very often we're given to think of the underworld, right, or hell, as being a chaotic realm. But for the Greeks, that is not strictly speaking true. It's not especially chaotic. In fact, if anything, Hades, the realm of Hades and its lord, its eponymous lord, the god, is a realm of like stultifying stasis, right? The sky realm is full of like eternal change, but potential, right? You know, so there's change in the form of lightning and clouds and stuff, right? That weather that's changing around, but also there's the eternal round of the stars, the rising and setting of the sun, right? And the stars in their paths and the wandering planets and stuff, right? It is an eternal realm. And I've talked about this before, right? That idea of the eternal realm that is sort of changeless and predictable versus, right, the much more frenetic realm that we find ourselves living in on the ground, right? But then beneath us, there is this realm of like deep mystery and inaccessible sort of changelessness, right? You know, the realm of Hades isn't like Christian hell. It's not full of hot burning fire and torture. That's not, generally speaking, what's happening there. What's happening is that it's cold. The life has gone out of things. It's cold, it's still, it's forever, but it's motionless. It's a place of stasis. When all the juice has run out of the battery, the cell phone just sits there dead forever, right? Just dead forever. That is the sort of the horror of the Greek afterlife. You know, sometimes, of course, with like futility attached to it. So the Greeks, of course, had a deep sense of horror around futility and its relationship to the infinite. See the myth of Sisyphus, right? Push the boulder up the hill, drag it down again. That kind of stuff really freaked them out. But you know, they're generally speaking, it's this sense of stasis. It's not particularly active. But the realm of Poseidon is active. It's chaotic, right? It's chaotic explicitly. So to note that, you know, Polyphemus is descended from Poseidon is to note that he is, in some real sense, right, a prince of chaos, right? He's a prince of this realm. Okay, so he's got tremendous power and he's got this one-pointedness. And what happens? You know, they arrive and Odysseus's men are a little like, and Odysseus is like, no, you know, let's go take a look. Let's go take a look. He's feeling bold. He's feeling confident. He's feeling forthright about the whole thing. So fine. So they amble uphill and they find the cave and it turns out the guy isn't there. And so they just help themselves. Why? Because they're operating on this sort of like regal assumption that they're going to be received as honored guests. Again, this is sort of the hubris in some sense, right? The ego inflation of Odysseus talking. And so, you know, oh, well, he'll be back in a bit. Let's just like tuck into his cheese. It's just like, if I came home and I had a guest who I hadn't met, who I wasn't expecting, and they were eating the cheese out of my fridge, I don't know if I would devour them, but I would probably be unhappy. I recall once my father was visiting me, and so I gave him the code to let himself in, and da-da-da-da-da. And when I arrived back, he was drinking my bottle of 1492, which is this quite high-end bourbon. And I hadn't even opened this bourbon. And he had drank like half the bottle. And I was not happy because, not that he helped himself to a drink. It's fine that he helped himself to a drink. But like, let's be honest, after the first couple of drinks, you're not tasting the quality of the 1492. For God's sake, switch to, you know, Jack Daniels or something, right? Have a nice one on the nice one and then switch. This is the idea of the good wine and the utility wine. You know, you drink a really good bottle first because you can taste it. And then if you're going to continue drinking, you switch to something else. That's like, at that point, you can't tell the difference. So who cares? Anyway, so to be fair, I didn't devour my father in that case either, nor did he devour me, I think. So they start helping themselves to the cheeses, right? And then tuck in. And then Polyphemus arrives home and he heaves a great big stone. So we have sealed the bottle, to borrow the alchemical. Okay, there's a bunch of these, but we have sealed the bottle. When you seal the bottle, alchemically speaking, you create that hermetic seal. What you're about to do is create a reaction, right? You seal the bottle so that you can force the contents to be under pressure and reaction. So this marks a certain thing. We have, right, created the magic circle. We have sealed the bottle, a huge stone. And the huge stone is beyond the power of the men to move. That's sort of essential. The giant can move it because, and he's got that one-pointedness. But now they're in there, right? So what do? He's like, who the hell are you? And they're like, oh, hi, you know, we're here. Sorry, we ate your cheese. We're here. And he's like, oh, yeah? Okay. You know, you've trespassed. Well, I'll show you some hospitality. And he starts grabbing guys and like smashing them and eating them. And then he bolts it down with milk. I think that's very interesting that he's a milk drinker. I like milk. I know not everybody does. I know that there are a great number of people, obviously, in the globe who are straight up lactose intolerant, and lots of other people who are vegan and object, of course, that human beings are, we're the only beings that drink something else's milk. That is not actually, properly speaking, true. There are other entities, other animals that drink milk. In the same way as there are other animals that drink blood and so on and so forth. It's not that uncommon, actually. But nevertheless, right, like, there are the people who are like, milk is for children, and they don't like it. I love it. I don't drink it that often anymore, but drinking like a tall glass of milk, especially with a dessert or something, just delightful. Now, drinking a tall glass of milk with screaming man flesh is not something that I have customarily consumed, although sometimes, I guess, if it was spicy, having a glass of milk does help dissolve the spice. So who knows? Maybe eating Greeks is spicy. Anyway, enough. So, what does he do? He smashes their brains out, like he picks them up and kills them as though they were, sort of puppies is the description that gets used, right? Right? Just brutally killing them while everybody is powerless to do anything. And he tears them apart and he eats them. He fills himself up. There is a quality of gluttony to this, right? And they'll glug, 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 glug. You can sort of imagine the milk running down his face, blood and milk. It's gross. And this quality of gluttony and consumption in the face of things, right? There is no hospitality. There's no law. There's no right? And frankly, he's offended in a way that Odysseus swaggers in and is sort of presumptuous enough to be like, you wouldn't go against the gods. And he's like, dude, my dad is a god. I'm going to eat you, right? And shows pretty pure contempt in a sense, because he just shows no concern for threat at all. No concern for threat at all. Okay, so, right. So this gluttony, which is evidenced both by Odysseus's men and Odysseus himself, right? This presumptuous consumption, right? Is then likewise echoed, right? There's something of the appetites about the giant. It's a very shadowy kind of figure in this sense, right? It's been projected and written huge, that it's sort of like one-pointed and, incapable of shifting and favors sort of strength above all else and is interested in slaking itself. It consumes, right? Fills itself with man meat and collapses. I shouldn't say man meat. Fills itself with human flesh and then collapses, Okay, so this is awful. It's a terrible thing to see. In symbolic terms, again, we might look at this and be like, okay, so what's happening here? We're having a shadow confrontation with another male figure, and the male figure is evidencing this one-pointedness, this inflexibility, and also the tremendous power of that. And it scoffs at any kind of social norm. It's like, your social norm, shut up, right? And it, is unconcerned about threats, right? This is a set of shadow projections. I mean, this is effectively what got Odysseus into this position, right? And it's like, what do I have to worry about? Like, I'm the son of a god, right? Which, frankly, is not far away from Odysseus' position. It's a shadow confrontation. And then the shadow proceeds to devour the men, where the men are constantly standing in as this framework of, yes, instincts and appetites, but also motivations, right? Your instincts and your appetites form a powerful framework for your motivations, right? They're very often what drives you forward. And in the absence of them, simply having a rational goal doesn't often connect. And so what's happening? Like, the shadow is bulking up, right? Okay. So then the plan is hatched. And, right, Odysseus goes into revenge mode, but also clever mode. And we see what happens. He takes the club and he whittles it to a point and he hardens it in the fire, right? In the absence of sort of stone or metal spear tips, hardened wood is a classic way. If you put something in the fire, it carbonizes it, so you get a much harder point. So basically, and he heats it up red hot, right? This is like, having to like lance a boil where, something is heated to sterilize it quite hot and, puts in, and it'll sizzle through flesh, right? That's sort of common thing that used to be done by doctors and stuff. And the idea is then what? Get them drunk on good wine, right? Echo of the lotus eater. So this is something that ought to be consumed in moderation, and it's delicious and it ought to be appreciated, but instead it's just sort of guzzled down until there's a state of drunkenness. And then what? There's the vomiting, right? So given so much wine, right, allowed to sort of indulge to its full extent, the shadow figure can't actually keep it down. And there's this like vomiting. And then after that, into a snoring moment. Now, before that, Odysseus, does something clever. What does he do? He renounces his persona in a sense. He says, I'm nobody. For a person that's pretty inflated, this is like an interesting move to make, right? It's a very interesting move to make because it's a little bit like all of the medieval authorship, right? That, wrote a book and then either attributed it to somebody else, which I add is probably what happened with the works of Homer, or write all these texts that we find that are anonymous. This is a foreign idea to us a little bit in the modern era. The idea that you would write a book and then render it anonymous and like not take credit for it, this seems very strange. We're very concerned in our culture with attribution and sourcing. In academia, certainly, you have to cite. Why do you have to cite? Because people are concerned with the citations. Everybody needs to know whose work is what. It's the same thing, basically, in sort of the online world, right? You want people to reference you, to retweet you, to carry you. There's a sense that the social translational aspect of this kind of stuff is about people knowing it was you, right? Patent law, intellectual property generally, all this stuff comes around like ownership and invention. Who did it? Who came up with it? But that was not always a dominant idea, right? For centuries, authors wrote things and either attributed them to somebody else or went anonymous. Think about that for a second. That's just like putting the work up for the work's own sake, but not expecting it to come back to you. Like maybe a few people know, but like your book goes forward and nobody knows that you wrote it. It's a slightly unusual mindset from the modern framework. It's a bit like making an anonymous donation to a charity, right? Which is a thing that we still have contact with, right? Making a donation and keeping it anonymous. So here we see this moment where Odysseus sort of steps away from his inflation. He says, I'm nobody. Now, he's doing a clever thing here, right? Because it seems like he knows that he's setting this up, that if the guy cries for help, he'll be sort of too stupid, right, to parse through this. And indeed, that's the way that it goes. But also notice what's required here. He can't lean in on this self-aggrandizing impulse. So drunken giant pukes. He moves up. He's got the red hot, right, spike. And what does he do? It's like, bam, and like leans his weight into it. But this is a ghastly kind of image. Anytime I'm in a car and I'm driving on the highway and I have to like scratch around my eye, I have this like persistent flash that's like, oh no, like if we haven't hit a pothole, I'm going to go in up to my knuckle into my own eyeball. This is something that like, I'm not super skeeved out by eyeballs, but for some reason that specific symbol really flips me out. It's like when I'm running up a set of concrete stairs, I sometimes consider tripping and taking the edge of the stairs with my teeth flying everywhere. It's never happened, thankfully. Probably not going to. Likewise, I'm unlikely to gouge out my own eye. But the point is, like, it's a ghastly and direct image. Like, it freaks us out, this idea. And so, boom, in goes the superheated spike. And they grind it. They grind it in. Like, it's really ghastly. They take it right down to the root. Okay, so Polyphemus wakes up and he's screaming and whatever, and he's sort of lashing about. And what does he do? He opens the door because only he's capable of doing so, and he cries for help. Who's bothering you? Because there's no law. Who's bothering you? Right? And the answer is nobody. Nobody's bothering me. And they're all like, then why are you bothering us? Right? Fine, clever Odysseus. Now, there's a second debasement here, which is Odysseus's men exit as sheep. Right? They put themselves between two sheep. They keep a low profile. So this is clever because they're stringing themselves in such a way as like they're immune to the Cyclops' pat down, but also they're sort of sandwiching themselves in sheep. They're again, it's a throwing away to be on the belly of a sheep is, symbolically speaking, throwing away a kind of inflation. And Odysseus holds a little to himself because he is beneath the prize ram. And then we have this moment where, in patting down the ram, Polyphemus has this sort of meditation on aging, which is, it's a striking moment. It's a strange shift in the emotional tone, because he suddenly goes from being like a like a guttural, gluttonous monster, right? Who we are sort of grossed out by and hate at some level. And suddenly there is this real tinge of sadness, right? Where he's talking about this prize sheep. It reminds me often when I read it of a news story I saw many years ago where this guy had a horse. He had a little, like a pony, like a little horse, and it was against city bylaws. And so I think I've talked about this before, but anyway, it was against city bylaws. And so they were, of course, making him get rid of his horse. And they had this interview with the guy, and he was like, all I've ever wanted was a little horse. And I love Bill, and Bill loves me, and they're not going to take my little horse away. And watching this thing, you were just like, oh my God, like just bend the bylaws. Let the guy have his little horse, Let him have his little horse. So there's this moment where the Cyclops is interacting with his prize ram, and it has very much this quality, this like elegiac, mournful quality as he's interacting. And it's this kind of meditation on aging, which is very striking in this context. It's like, oh, the power figure here is carrying something. The power figure is a shadow figure, and it's carrying this meditation on aging. And it's precisely this meditation on aging that Odysseus lacks, right? He has no sense of this. That's why he's so tied into this heroic stuff. And Odysseus here is clinging to the underside of this thing, thinking, I'm so clever. He's smuggled himself out, right? Among the sheeple, as it were, thinking that he is so clever and superior. And so finally they get out, and fine, they get down to shore. And all of a sudden he can't help himself, right? Seemingly. And he's like, basically, hey, asshole. Yeah, you want to know who screwed you? Me. And this after the giant is already like heaving stuff in their direction, right? It's like the giant is still dangerous. It's still an enormous force of power. And the men are all going like, what are you doing? Don't antagonize him. They can't help it. He's so caught up in this sense of his own cleverness. He just needs to like grind it in, right? And then we have, of course, Polyphemus call out to Poseidon, right? Poseidon, who is the keeper over the seas filled with chaos and earthquake and like these real powers, and is like basically like, avenge me, screw this guy, right? Whose name I know. Like, he gave the keys of the kingdom away. Telling your true name and your home, that's like magic 101. You don't hand that out to the forces of darkness. But Odysseus can't help himself, right? It's a PR exercise for him. He wants him to know. He wants him to know. Tell everybody, like, I screwed you. And of course, this obviously, right, creates a tremendous problem for him. Okay, so from there we get the and there's a lot more we can say there, but obviously, right, I have to pay somewhat attention to time. I think I've already racked up another hour, so I'm going to have to pick up the pace here. So from there we get Aeolus's, the bag of Aeolus, the bag of winds. And the bag of winds, again, we have like a greed moment here. I'll probably do this bag of winds and then I'll break and I'll record part 3, because I think it's been like an hour. And so as it is, I'll be recording more than I sort of anticipated. I don't want to bury you guys. So, okay. Aeolus has the bag of winds. And what is this? This is like the winds to help them get home, minus the west wind, minus the west wind, minus the wind out of the west. Now, why the west? Well, presumably he was heading west. So you don't want a headwind. That's one thing. But the west is also the place that the sun sets, right? There's a direction in moving from east to west that is the direction the sun goes. And that's why it's not uncommon to think of the west as being the land of the dead. It's the place that the sun sets, right? Of course, it's the land of the dead, off the end of the world, right? So you don't want that west wind, because that is the direction that you're heading. Again, you can see a bit of an intimation here. Notice that the shadow is the bearer of the intimation of death during the Cyclops scene, right? And the intimation of death really hasn't captured him. And the intimation of death, that idea that like when you hit the pivot point of life, you are increasingly oriented towards the other horizon. You're oriented towards the end. There's more behind you than ahead of you, right? Is sort of precisely what is missing for Odysseus. you know, he wants to remain in the glory days of the first half of his life, and so he does. He remains missing and lost. So, okay, so we get the bag of winds, and what happens? This is a sort of a classic moment in various, you know, instances of Greek mythology, which is his men are dumb, as they often are, right? His sort of will and appetites and instincts are dumb, and they assume that this thing's a bag of treasure. And so they open it up, and in so doing, this once again, right, it unleashes forces that they don't expect. We can see sort of echoes of that particular theme in various other strands. So it has an obvious resemblance, okay, to Pandora. And Pandora's box is not properly a box. It's really more like a small urn or pot properly, but Pandora's box, right? And we all know the story of Pandora's box. Pandora gets given this box, and it has all the evils of the world in it. And when it opens up, everything flies out except one thing, hope, which stays in the bottom. Now, interestingly, this sometimes gets interpreted as being like, oh, right, there was one other thing. And thankfully, hope stayed behind. Hope was in the box and stayed behind. How wonderful that all the evils flew out into the world, but we got to keep hope. But another interpretation of this is hope is one of the evils. It's the one that stays behind, and it's sort of the most pernicious. That hope, where there ought not to be hope, right, is pernicious. Hope is an alternative in some sense to action. Now, that is not strictly speaking true, but you can think of many cases where people hope for things to change, but they don't, you know, they're not taking action to make them change. They're not recognizing that that needs to come from some internal perspective. I was having a conversation with a friend and colleague last week who said something really striking to me in this respect. She said, you know, for years I got involved in so many things and so many projects because, you know, it's like I wanted a seat at the table, right? I wanted to prove something. And I, you know, have a reputation for being useful, she said, you know, useful and effective. And so I would get drafted into stuff. And she said, and I, at the back of my mind, I always had this idea that at some point, some force, some outside force or person would reach in and say, good job, that's it. Good job. You did a great job. Thank you. And now you can stop. And she said, you know, and at some point I realized, I believe in the past year, it's been an interesting reflective year for a lot of people. She was like, I just realized that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. The only person who's going to do that for me is me. And if I let this simply continue with the hope that that's going to occur, I won't change. I'm going to keep involving myself in the same, pouring the energy on and accomplishing. And this, like, you did a good job and now you can rest and you can shift gears a bit. It's just never going to come from the outside. It's going to come from the inside. So hope can be pernicious, right? Now, also it can be useful. It's mixed, frankly, right? You need some hope in order, you know, often in sort of the darkest moments. And you see this, of course, in therapy a lot, right? But sometimes you have to engage a state of hopelessness. You have to like work through it. Hope can keep you from sort of dealing with the grief of a real situation. With that, you know, people hold out hope for relationships coming back to them. They hold out hope for situations to resolve. They hold out hope for these sort of divine bolts that are going to come in and save them from themselves, right? The hope that people and situations are going to change. And sometimes when you're truly hopeless, you have to hang on to something. But sometimes it's the case that you need to confront your hopelessness, that you need to sit in it, that you need to deal with it, that you need to really fully absorb it so that you can move forward. Because sometimes the hopes that you're holding are obstacles. You're holding hopes for things that aren't going to happen, or that you need to make happen, that aren't going to be delivered to you, right? And probably aren't going to be delivered in an idealized way, even if you work for them, right? That's hard. Okay, so Pandora's box is one of these sort of versions. It's like, don't look in the box. Oh no, everything flew out of the box, right? Very similar to the bag of winds in that sense. You can see a kind of parallel version of this in the fairy tale of Bluebeard. Bluebeard is a more malevolent version. It's kind of a similar to the Beauty and the Beast sort of story, but Bluebeard, of course, has this primary quality where it's sinister and it's like, don't look in this one room. right? Don't look in this one room. And of course, she looks in the room, and what's in there? Like all of his previous dead brides, and blah. And in most versions of the story, he then kills her, right? And so it's a like, don't look in the forbidden place kind of thing, right? So Pandora's box has that quality a little bit too, but so does this. And what is it that drives the soldiers to it when they are sort of driven to tear it open? They think it's full of treasure. It's very crass. And we're not talking about treasure here in the like, oh, spiritual gold type treasure. It's acquisitive, right? And we see this theme repeated over and over and over again. The raid is acquisitive, right? The interaction with the Cyclops is acquisitive, and then the Cyclops itself is like a projected shadow version of this covetousness and acquisitiveness, right? Gluttony. And we see it again here. It's like, maybe it's full of treasure. Oh, no, right? And out flies the thing that probably could get them home, but also, of course, it unleashes force in a way that they don't expect. The instincts think that they're getting something relatively material, and what they get overwhelms them wildly and blows the whole thing off course. And of course, the ego is not really paying attention, right? It's sort of like knows what's going on, but it's not adequately controlling the circumstance. And so everything is overwhelmed. Okay, so next we're going to deal with the cannibals, Island of the Cannibals, the Lystrogonians. But I'm going to break here because I think that's been about an hour, and then we'll go to hour 3, and I promise I'll wrap this up in 3. Okay, so part 3.